At this point, we're going to introduce our experts, the people that's going to engage you, challenge you, and enlighten you. Our first speaker, from, as they say, in the house, she is our affirmative action officer. So she's here to make sure that the playing field will always be level and that no one will be deemed invisible. Let's give a grand campus welcome to Christina Vargas. Our next speaker, Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist. He served as editor and columnist at Newsday and is the founder of the National Association of Black Journalists. And at any given moment on any given channel, you will see his face and the sharing of his knowledge and expertise as to what kind of world we live in. Let's give a round of applause to Mr. Les Payne. Keep in mind that this is a class module that ends around 12:15, so we got to try to keep it sweet and short, or short and sweet, depends on how you want to look at it. My question is, what made the year 1964 so special or so ripe for what transpired during that time period?
Good morning, everyone. Buenos días, todos. Buenos días, yes, hello. Okay. There were a few things, I think, that preceded 1964 that are kind of moments in time in United States history. And one, of course, is the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, right? He was assassinated in 1963. And at the time, President Johnson actually addressed Congress. And I wanted to make sure I brought in this quote as a result of his address, because he said, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Act, which he had fought for so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is now time to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law." You add that with the groundswell of the entire civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and all of the different organizing groups in the South that were literally fighting for people's lives. Remember that you're talking about a situation where we would not be sitting here today if it weren't for the work of those individuals. And a moment of silence is completely appropriate because people lost their lives on a daily basis. You're talking about a climate in the Jim Crow South where you could not do what other people did just on the basis of the color of your skin, regardless of your race or ethnicity, and especially if you were black. Remember, any person of color with one drop was considered black. And so for those of you who don't necessarily consider yourselves African American, these rules would apply to you in the same way if you were in the South at that time. And so I say this because I think, the bottom line is there needed to be a moment in time where these individuals came together and that African Americans and whites were going to work together, as we saw in the film, to ensure that that equality could be a reality.
I certainly will agree with that. I'm Les Payne, by the way, and good morning. And I'd like to thank the university for inviting me back here this second year to engage in a dialogue. Normally, I'm invited once, and that's pretty much it. But to the staff, faculty, students, it's good to be here. And to Mr. Daniels, let me just say, when he so forcibly asked you to stand, I thought he was doing a riff on 50 Cent to see if anybody was in a wheelchair. That's an in-group thing. But at any rate, to the question as to why 1964 is so important, I think that things were coming to a head. Yes, the President of the United States had been initially gunned down in Dallas. LBJ was trying to carry on in his way Martin Luther King, since '57, had been carrying on the civil rights movement. He had been doing his thing. In addition to that, as we all know, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963, and shortly after that, in fact, a couple of weeks after that, was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and 4 little black girls were ignominiously killed by the Klan, of course, and people fighting for what they considered to be white supremacy. In addition to that, you had Medgar Evers, who was killed in 1963. Martin Luther King's house was bombed. So things were really running amok violently. And the violence essentially was caused by the Klan spearheading the groups that were fighting for white supremacy. The African Americans, Martin Luther King group, of course, were nonviolent. They believed in nonviolent direct action. But some of the younger people had decided that this nonviolent direct action, was good for its time, but it was time to try something else. And so as the film showed there at the end, in fact, they'd done a lot of the work, we would just kind of come behind it, that last quote that said, if you crack Mississippi, you can crack the South. And I would add, if you crack the South, then you could crack the country, because this is an indivisible country, and the South wasn't separate really, except in terms of laws that they had on the book. So at any rate, Robert Moses, whom you saw there, young-looking Robert Moses, who was a math science teacher, had decided that he, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, that they would get together. And what they had noticed is that when white students were involved, now blacks had been dying, in great numbers over time, but when white students were involved, that the media was more alert, more attentive, and the nation became more focused on what was going on because some of their sons and daughters were down there. He said, look, what we need to do is to organize white students and white supporters to come to Mississippi so that the media would be more attentive. And so he thought and miscalculated that the white racists, the Klan, would be less inclined to commit brutality and to kill people if whites were involved. And so in 1964, they began, he started his program in 1961. And by 1964, which is the question, they said, we will call this Freedom Summer, which the film was about. And the whole idea was to involve whites in the voter registration moves in Mississippi. And so they had a meeting on the campus of the Women's College, Western College for Women in Oxford, Ohio, not Mississippi, Oxford, Ohio, in June of 1964. And that's when they were gathered and they were briefed. They were told, look, the South is very dangerous. These people are armed, they're racist, they don't really care about you, by the way. Although African Americans were the #1 targets, they were not the only targets. The white supremacists there, the Klan in particular, had targeted Catholics. They were against Catholics, all Catholics. They were against Jews. They were against immigrants. These were their targets. Now, African Americans were the #1 target, but they were against like everybody. And a lot of people who went down, in fact, were from some of these other groups. And so that was a mass. And of course, it came to a head when you saw Goodman. In fact, we saw his brother, Goodman, Cheney, Goodman, and Swerner were the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in June of 1964. And that's when the country really began to pay sharp attention.
Interesting point that you made, because one of the people who ultimately was arrested for the slaying of the 3 civil rights workers, at the time he said, well, we got 3 of them. We got 1 Jew, we got 1 N-word, and we got 1 white man. And they were really kind of gloating over this situation. Now, my question to you is, why would a student, I think as mentioned in the film, 18 or 19 or 20, would want to risk their lives and go to Mississippi? Why would a student do that? What would be their motivation? I mean,
students active. These students the same way. They're young. They want to live life. They are not bogged down, except with student loans. they want to live life. They were adventurous, and I think they cared about the world because the world belonged to them. And that is where we are today. The world belongs not to the baby boomers, my generation. It belongs to you. It belongs to your younger brothers and sisters. And I think they realize that. And they brought a great deal of energy, a great deal of excitement, a great deal of curiosity, and a great deal of enthusiasm, then as now.
Okay.
I would just add something really important, and I think that is that you are not much different than some of those students. The fact that you notice what's going along and around in the world around you, the fact that you have values and expectations of how you'd like to see the world in front of you. These students saw a flyer in the student center, like she just said, or in the dorm where she lived. This student was thinking about the fact that there's a future ahead of her for her children, that she wanted a better place. And so what I would say to you is, it may seem like, wow, they were extremely courageous. And I'm not sure if I could do the same thing, but they were willing to take that risk knowing that they were going to build a better place. There was a larger meaning for them because they could see what was happening to people all over the country right around them.
And let me just say that beginning in 1961, when I was a student at the University of Connecticut, when I was a sophomore, that's when the Robert Moses program came to the University of Connecticut, and they had organized, I wasn't the organizer, but there was something called the Northern Student Movement on the campus of the University of Connecticut. And I saw them doing, and what they were doing, they would send material, they would raise money on campus and in the community of Willimantic and stores, which is where the University of Connecticut was, and they would send clothing, food, money to blacks in the Delta of Mississippi. And then they began in 1962 to send actual bodies, people would volunteer to go to Mississippi from the Northern Student Movement. I became the president of the Northern Student Movement. My roommate, Brian Steinberg, who was the secretary of the Northern Student Movement on the campus of the University of Connecticut, Brian went down that summer. I did not. I'm no fool. No, I was born in Alabama. I knew what was at stake. I didn't go down. Brian went down and worked that hot summer, which became not only a freedom summer, but a very, very, very bloody summer.
Now, my question to you guys is that these students went down to Mississippi. Where did they stay?
Oh, they stayed with people in the communities. The blacks in the community gave them shelter. They did not go down and stay in the hotels and the Holiday Inn. They stayed with the community. They worked with the community. And by the way, the teaching was their briefing when they were told at Oxford that yes, it's going to be dangerous. Yes, you should obey the laws. Yes, you should make sure you can somehow raise bail money. But they were given a briefing as to what to expect. And they were told that they would teach some of the younger students. They got involved. They got to know them. They really lived in the community.
Those dialogues and conversations were not easy because there were some students, even though they were screening to make sure that they were there for the right reasons, who had to really understand the full magnitude of the seriousness and the potential danger that they would be in. And so if an African-American student also shared with them, you need to be careful because of the following. They show in the scene later there was kind of some nervous laughter. And that broke down the conversation. Like, this is not a joke. You know, this is not funny. You could lose your life. There are individuals here who will lose their lives if you don't realize how you need to approach this. We live here. We understand the dynamics that we're dealing with. So please work with us and help us partner. And they actually stayed up all night and had that breakthrough to get through that tough conversation around that conflict. Because if you can't go there, you can't trust each other enough to do the work that was necessary.
Okay, my next question is, when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what does it mean to have that type of civil rights? So if you go back with the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, you know, black men were given the right to vote. So why was there a need for a Civil Rights Act?
Let me, and Ms. Vargas will do the legalistic end of it, But what I think it is important. Yes, it is history. It's history of 50 years ago, but history is hugely important so that we can understand the present, and we need to understand the present so we can go into the future. So let me give a little background, because one of the misconceptions that people have, and informed, knowledgeable people have, in the South. And by the way, I was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the 40s. And I don't know, have any of you ever been to South Africa? Is anyone here from South Africa? No one from South Africa. Anyone ever been to South Africa? Anyone ever heard of apartheid in South Africa? Okay. Well, there was a system in the system of apartheid, what made it different from what we experience now or in the 60s, 70s on Long Island is that it was a legalistic system where things were written down in law, codified. Racist white supremacy was codified. Let me just give you an example. It wasn't just that African Americans could not vote and they could not go to school. That was a long plethora. In fact, in South Africa, they had 350 separate pieces of legislation which controlled the behavior of Africans in South Africa. For instance, an African who worked as a painter could not apply the last coat of paint on a wall. That had to be done by a white person. You could put on the primer, you could sand it, but the last coat of paint on a wall, interior and exterior in South Africa under that system until 1994, when Nelson Mandela became president, had to be applied by a white person. Now, similar laws, by the way, and by the way, the Boers who instilled those laws started in 1948 came to America and studied Jim Crow laws. This is where they got the idea from this country, starting after the Civil War. Now, Jim Crow laws, some people say, well, you know, you couldn't vote, you couldn't go to school with whites. But here's, and I'd like to read, if I may, just a couple of the actual lettering of the laws throughout the South, which made the Civil Rights Act necessary if this country was going to come into civilized society. Here's one, take teaching, you're in school here. Quote, any instructor who shall teach in any school, college, or institution where members of the white and colored race are enrolled as pupils for instruction shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and upon conviction thereof shall be fined in any sum not less than $10, which was a lot of money then, no more than $50 for each offense. If a teacher was caught teaching a class at any level in Oklahoma where blacks and whites were, that was a misdemeanor. Now, say you want to go out with your white friend and have a beer in Georgia. This is what the law said. All persons licensed to conduct the business of selling beer or wine shall serve either white people exclusively or colored people exclusively, and shall not sell to the two races within the same room at any time. Toilet facilities. Every employee of white or Negro male shall be provided for a separate toilet facility in the state of Alabama. Again, in the state, my home state of Alabama, this is a law I was born into, and it was enforced, by the way. No person or corporation shall require any white female nurse in wards or rooms in hospitals, either public or private, in which Negro men are placed. If you were a white nurse, you were not allowed in a room or ward where there was a Negro man. Now, marriage, they were real keen on marriage. The marriage of a person of Caucasian blood with a Negro, Mongolian, by that they meant Chinese, Malay, or Hindu, Indians, shall be null and void in the state of Arizona. Now they're talking about same sex. We're talking about a whole nother level. In Florida, the marriage law read, all marriages between a white person and a Negro, or between a white person and a person of Negro descent to the fourth generation inclusive, or thereby herefore forever prohibited. And in Missouri, they got real technical. All marriages between white persons and Mongolians are prohibited. No person having 1/8 part or more of Negro blood shall be permitted to marry any white person, nor shall any white person be permitted to marry any Negro having 1/8 part or more of Negro blood. That's in the state of Missouri. Now, if you say, okay, you couldn't get married, maybe you could kind of go out and have some fun, kind of mess around. Not in Florida. This is how that law read. Any Negro man and white woman, or any white man and Negro woman who are not married to each other, and of course, who couldn't be married to each other, who shall habitually live in and occupy in the nighttime the same room, shall each be punished by imprisonment not exceeding 12 months or by fine not exceeding $500. That was in the liberal state of Florida. Now, say you want to go to the park. It shall be unlawful for colored people to frequent any park owned or maintained by the city for the benefit, use, and enjoyment of white persons. Restaurant. Licensed restaurant shall serve either white people exclusively or colored people exclusively, and shall not sell to the two races within the same room or serve the two races anywhere under the same license.
I tell you, I remember those days. So now, let's get back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and what led Johnson to that decision, and what did the actual act entail?
So first, any reactions? Anybody surprised by some of the things that Mr. Payne outlined? It sounds unbelievable, right? Show of hands, surprise? Like, hello. Again, this is supposed to be dialogue, so I really want to see your reactions, because it's sometimes even hard to swallow, given the world we're in today, that could be even imaginable. But we're still dealing with those repercussions in our lifetime. So I want to bring up—
Or in your parents' lifetime.
In your parents' lifetime, in my parents' lifetime. So I want to bring up the actual pieces that are in the law that actually affect you today. The reason I even have a job is because there's an expectation that these civil rights laws are still enforced to this day. And so what were in the provisions in the act included voting rights. So you couldn't have unequal application of voter registration requirements following the act, and then the following year they also passed the Voting Rights Act to ensure that there would be no restrictions placed on the ability for individuals to vote. There's been some evolution of these laws over the course of the last 50 years. A huge piece of this act was also around public accommodations, and that included hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, all public venues. And so there could no longer be those Jim Crow segregation expectations because of this act. I would say that you should also know the Civil Rights Act covers other broad categories, including religion, national origin, gender, and then additional acts have added to the protected categories under the act. The two you may know the most about is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which includes higher education. That means that this room has to be diverse. This room has to include people from all backgrounds and ethnicities. And they would authorize you to withdraw your federal funds if you did not follow those. So if you don't accept federal funds, you can have whatever kind of school you like. But if you're accepting any money, you must have these opportunities. And Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is the piece based on employment. And so you could no longer write a job application or refuse someone a position as a result of their race, color, or ethnicity. In the past, it was perfectly legal if you had a job opening to put in the ad, I would like a person who was this age, who was white, who was male. Now, bringing it to the present, there's an agency that was formed as a result of the Civil Rights Act, and that is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission now. That commission is where you can bring your complaints of discrimination, and that's where you can actually bring forward these concerns. And if you Google right now the EEOC's website, you can see all of the different cases that they are bringing forward and the claims of discrimination that individuals, due to lack of hiring, that you can see what's happening. And there were some reports this year as a result of the 50th anniversary that compared some of the numbers and help you understand kind of the major shifts that happen in someone's daily life. So for example, unemployment rate for blacks in 1964 was 9.6%, and for whites it was only 4.6%. That disparity still exists, and it's higher today, okay? The unemployment rate for blacks is 11.9% in 2013, and it was only 5.9% for whites in 2013.
So I'm going to ask the two of you, because you brought up a good point in terms of comparing in 64 where we are today. So what would be your overall assessment in terms of looking at the Civil Rights Act and where we are today? And as you answer that question, if you can prognosticate as to where we're going to be 50 years from now.
Well, I'll just speak really quickly, because again, I'm here for a reason, and that is because I'm trying to work with all of you and with the college to really be an ambassador to ensure that every single individual at this college feels a level of respect, dignity, and opportunity in the classroom, and that you will have opportunity in the future. So what I would say is, where have we come from? I think we're in a very interesting place in time. If you talk about the gains that the Civil Rights Act allowed us, the perceptions about affirmative action after the Civil Rights Act in order to gain the numbers into the different communities that we talk about, and the employment opportunities and in academics, there's been a lot of debate about whether that works and who feels strongly about whether or not we're doing the right thing on those areas. But I would say my big takeaway comes from my work in an organization on Long Island called Erase Racism. Erase Racism stands for advocacy and education around issues of institutional racism. Structural racism is different than individual acts of prejudice. And some of the things we talk about are opportunities for individuals to live where they need to live, to have opportunities to go to the right kinds of schools, to have access to the same types of education and the same levels of opportunity. And people are afraid to talk about race. I think that's where we've been left. We've been left with this concern about, if I say something racial, oh boy, this, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion, and you don't talk about race, right? And so what I would hope that we can do in the future is open up the dialogue about race, socioeconomics, and still have the conversation about race in the relevant spaces and places where we need to think about it, even though we would like to hope that it's something that we won't treat people differently on the basis of their race. But we do notice race. We do see differences in people's treatment based on race. We do see different outcomes based on race. And so even though it's not something that's in your blood, it is not something biological, it is something that has been socially constructed in the United States history, race does matter, and you have to pay attention to differences in order to make solutions for different groups of people. Thank you.
I'll try to be as brief so we can hear questions from you. In terms of changes, yes, I think that there have been changes made, and I think those changes have been driven by the people who were suffering. I think it was the African American who drove those changes. People like Robert Moses, Fannie Lou Hamer, King, Malcolm, and others. And I think that there have been changes. Statistically, the ones that she gave us in terms of the number of black political officials there are now, and the fact that there is an African-American president. Having said that, though, I think that therein, for me, lies the secret, and that is where we started earlier with the Freedom Summer. It begins with young people, because the baby boom was, number one, the day is over. And I think they're irreparably damaged, and there's no hope, for the Hillary Clinton generation. Thank you very much. It's gone. It's over. The secret is with the younger generation. If you look at Barack Obama's election in 2008, the first African-American president, and he was running against a guy who was basically insane, John McCain. I mean, it's crazy. I'm a Vietnam veteran too, so I can say this. It's impolite to talk about McCain. He's nuts. Look, you do not spend 5.5 years in a prison camp with the North Vietnamese and undergo what he went through and come out sane. And that's not great. He's a hero and all of that. He was a fly boy, cowboy going in. But anyway, here's a guy, who's totally incompetent of being president of anything. No leadership qualities, even when he was in the Air Force. I knew him. He was reckless then. He was a reckless flyboy, cowboy pilot. And he was involved in a shootout on an aircraft carrier when I was in Vietnam in 1967. So, and here's a guy running for president of the United States. Unbelievable. But at any rate, but when you look at it, the baby boomers, white baby boomers, voted overwhelmingly for this guy, who's a cipher, against the first African-American president. Younger people, whites, 34 and younger, voted for this first African-American president, 66%. Older white baby boomers voted overwhelmingly for the cipher. 4 years later, you get another cipher. They end up with Romney. No one, I don't think Mrs. Romney likes him. I mean, you see the way this guy walks? I mean, he takes these little tiny steps. You know, I mean, this guy is right out of some sitcom of the 1950s. Nobody liked this guy. His son likes him because he gave him $100 million. You know, you would like him too, at least publicly. But nobody likes this guy. They issue him up, and whites vote for him overwhelmingly. Again, African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, and a great majority of young whites voted for him. Therein lies the future. Therein lies the future. And any of you, women, men, anything, think that Hillary Clinton and that generation is the answer, think again.
Wow. So basically, you're saying that the answer is coming from our youth.
When you talk about the incidents with Ferguson, Missouri, and you think about all of the people who have come forward to recognize differences in treatment amongst individuals and not to just say that, oh, that just doesn't happen. I think one of the hardest situations we have is when we have a dialogue around race or issues and incidents with racism. I know that all over Twitter, all over Facebook, people have been talking about the differences in treatment by law enforcement, as an example, or talking about the differences in treatment in different settings. And I think if everyone really uses this opportunity to think deeply about what can be done to help facilitate change, we are in a good place. It's unfortunate we're still here, but I think that's a struggle we all have to be a part of.
What the Civil Rights Act did in '64, it dealt with legal de jure segregation and racism. I think that de facto racism and segregation still exists. And I think that the police brutality, and it's just not in Ferguson, as you know, it's also in New York City, and it's on Long Island, by the way, and I've raised kids here, you know, my wife and I, who's here, and we know Long Island it was created as a white township, as in South Africa, it's created as a white township, and it has maintained that reputation, thank you very much. I think that police brutality, and I.F. Stone pointed this out in 1965, police brutality of that nature, whether it's Eric Gardner, whether it's Michael Brown, whether it's Sean Bell, whether it's Timothy Stanberry, Amadou Diallo, you can go on and on. It is not, as some people mistakenly think, senseless and random. It is not senseless and random. I.F. Stone argued this, and I happen to agree with him, that police brutality has a cold racial logic behind it. It is a part of a systemic system of suppression that continues. It is not accidental. And in the old days, the Klan, by the way, when Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were found, their bodies were found, there were 16 people who were indicted, including the sheriff who was involved with taking those kids after he released them from prison. He was involved in their lynching. And I think that the police are involved, the Klan are involved. I think what we get now is that the police, yes, of New York City, are involved in a cold, logical system of police brutality which is designed to keep African Americans off the police force, to keep them in check, as well as particularly darker-skinned Latinos.
We're going to now go to the floor. We're going to ask you, the student, you, the faculty member, you, the community member, you, the staff member, to come forth and pose your questions.
Back then, they had SNCC, Student Nonprofit Organization Against Everything That's Happening. Do you think the students now would actually be inclined to doing that? I don't really see that much activism. There's more activism on Facebook and Instagram with nonsense. I don't think there's activism politically. Do you
Well, I
think
think-
that could be a chance?
I would raise a challenge to someone in this room to talk about the ideas that you can form to start that movement. I mean, there are existing groups out there that are working to push forward progress. Like you said, you know, even your act of reposting something that you've seen that will simulate thought, or an image that will ensure people understand the realities of the brutality that is going on, or just being able to organize your own meeting under the guise of whatever group you'd like to do that, you have the right to do that. I mean, that is part of what your student and academic experience can be. And I would say go for it.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Sita. I wanted to say thank you for coming out, and Les Payne, thank you for coming again. I remember the last time you were here. My question is, I'm trying to present it right. With Title VI, it was for diverse higher education, right? Now, is there something implemented where it goes towards what curriculums are being taught?
What I would say to you is that it requires that all opportunity and access is not based on race, color, religion, or gender. So you can't have a situation where someone is given preferential treatment over another. Now, the idea of including diverse ideas in the curriculum, the idea of including historical references
Correct.
that are reflective of all ethnicities and backgrounds and the experience of people of color in particular, African Americans in particular, it's not a requirement. It's necessary, absolutely necessary. But there are things you don't learn in your history class. There are things you don't learn in your literature class. There are things you don't necessarily learn out inside the classroom that are absolutely necessary. And that's where school boards come in terms of the direction at that level. And in terms of the expectation in higher ed, many schools have integrated the expectation of culture, the idea that you will learn about other cultures as part of the curriculum. But it's not necessarily a requirement. It's more about the exclusion of individuals and people.
So how do you go about trying to get something implemented like that? Like, I know growing up, African, you know, anything about Africa or African people was always slaveries, but I know we was here before slavery started. So how do we get to that part of history?
It's interesting because I'm a mom, and my son is, you know, in the 8th grade, and, you know, he made a note of when they were talking about slavery last year in the 7th grade, how much time they spent and whether his teacher was even comfortable discussing slavery. So even the pieces that are included, you have to make sure it's done in a way that allows for deeper thinking and allows for a full expectation of the information that you should know and the learning opportunities, the objectives that should be met. I would say it's probably a few different ways, and we could talk about it. One is to be understanding and involved in your school, to know what the curriculum has, to ensure that you're involved with the school boards. It's really easy for you know, teachers and principals and academics at that level, on the secondary level, to kind of make decisions without parents and others being informed.
Now, I think what she's referring to, what can we do on the collegiate level, I think.
Yeah, and that's where, again, at the collegiate level, there are opportunities to talk to faculty, to talk to chairs, and to our academic deans about the opportunities to infuse new things into the curriculum. So we would absolutely say that's something that we would have to hear from an administrative level to ensure that it's included and brought into the fold. But I will tell you that I know that people are paying attention to those issues. That's the need and that's the desire, because our students have to be prepared for the world and for the immediate needs right here in our own backyard.
Do you believe that all events of discrimination throughout history have some kind of common root, some kind of common cause, and if so, what is it?
All of them.
So discrimination has some common cause.
Yeah, I think it's ignorance. I think it's fear, and I think it's the projection of an inferiorities. I think that's it. You'll find it's common with all of them. Usually people tend to hate people they don't know and don't care to get to know. I think that the inferiorities that they attribute to them are inferiorities that they project onto them. For instance, if you look at anti-Semitism, there's a book called by Jean-Paul Sartre called, and you should read it if you haven't, Anti-Semitism in Jew, and he examines anti-Semitism in Europe, in France in particular, and what he suggests is that what anti-Semitism was a projection of the Germans' sense, you know, of inferiority onto this targeted group, the Jews, in the sense that they would say that, well, they run the banks, they control the media, they have all the money. That means that I don't have it, and I don't control it, and therefore, and I think that with African Americans, you don't get that system of projection of inferiority, you get a different set. And I think what it is, it's a genetic recessiveness. In other words, I think that really is at the bottom of white-black racism. You know, we can talk about it in great detail, but I think it is ignorance. That's why I think it's important that people should get to know each other. But these Jim Crow laws were designed so they would not get to know each other. It is inferiority complexes because the people who set up those laws did not want to compete with African Americans. They didn't want them playing baseball. They didn't want them playing football. They didn't want them going to their colleges because then they might see, you know, how they were no inferior being at all, but they were just like everyone else.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Morales. I just wanted to know, a lot of people think segregation is almost abolished, but what happens to the segregation with all the people that are crossing the border as we know them as aliens?
I don't know if I would call that segregation, but I would absolutely talk about it in terms of the fact that people fear difference, right? You know, individuals are coming to this country, and there are labels that are placed on individuals, calling people aliens, calling people illegal, calling people terms that are meant to hurt, that are meant to kind of promote intolerance and promote and promote really injustice. And so I see that as a thread that flows from all of these issues.
Each country has its own sense of bias and bigotry. For instance, if you're in Turkey, it's the Kurds. If you're in Afghanistan, it may be the Uzbeks. You know, if you're in Uganda, it may be the Kakwas by the Burgundians. People have their people that they say they are inferior, and they hate them, they don't know them, and they project their inferiority because they can identify them. In America, it is black and white, nothing else. Black and white is the permanent system. And for instance, I'm doing a part of history now. There was a time when the Italians came here in the 20s. The Italians came in great numbers in the 20s, and they were not white. They went through a period of probation. They were considered subterranean people. They said they used too much grease in their hair. They ate garlic, you know, and they were discriminated against when they got here. But to the degree that they were white, the generation after came in. The Irish, the same way. The Irish didn't become white until way in Boston. They still aren't quite, you know. But it is black. And with the Latinos, I think that the discrimination now, second and third generation will be, in this country, will be racial. Those from the Dominican Republic who will remain African, get back to his thing, Afro-Dominicans, will have a similar problem of assessment, of adjustment.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause and thank them for their efforts and their contributions today. Okay. Please give us your name and give us your fantastic question.
My name is Sandra Vega. How would you feel about the KKK recruiting people in Long Island for the past couple of weeks? The KKK and Long Island?
Oh, we missed that part. No. Yeah. Let's be clear about the neighborhoods and the areas in which these flyers have been produced. And you are talking about areas that are predominantly, that have some percentage of Latinos, African Americans, and people of color. And for someone to not realize that there's some correlation in Hampton Bays and in Shirley and in Rockville Center where these flyers have now shown up, is really not realizing the history and the legacy of the KKK even being active on Long Island. And when you talk about segregated communities and communities where people are allowed to live and not allowed to live, that's a sign of we don't want you living here. We don't want you in our stores. And I think that reality is pretty startling for some people because they don't understand that there's a legacy here of not tolerating difference and not necessarily feeling that communities can be blended in a way that creates a better community. And so yes, I think it's alarming, and I hate to say not surprising, but I think that gives us an opportunity to really have some meaningful discussion and direct action around ensuring people feel respected everywhere they go.
We talked about Mississippi, but because that was the topic, but I think Long Island is a work in progress when it comes to racism.
Well,
Thank you.
okay.
Hi, how are you? My name is Jeffrey Clinton. And I'm going to ask, if black people like continue to be oppressed, do you think we have the right to self-determination? And how do you think that would come about?
Well, look, this country, and this is what I think African Americans have to come to realize. This is kind of an in-group discussion, which we can get into. I think that what we have to realize, and when I was your age, I might have disagreed with this, but I think that there's an African American president. This country belongs to African Americans. There was a man named Albert Murray, who was a brilliant intellectual, who wrote an essay, which I suggest you read, on the Omni-Americans. And what he talked about is who built this country. Obviously, the indigenous people who were here, it is their country, it is their land, it belongs to them. But in terms of people coming, starting in 1492 or 1619 with us, I think that he said that there were 4 classes of people who he considered the Omni-Americans who built this country, and who are fully vested, and in the case of African Americans, owed an awful lot. That's what the reparation questions is about. He said these people are the New Englanders, which are the Brahmin Mayflower types. That's one group. The other group are the frontiersmen, the people who went west and who went south. And then he said there are the ex-slaves, you know, who were part of it, and then there were immigrants who came later. Now, these people built this country, and therefore we're vested. So, would you walk away? I mean, if you worked at your parents worked in a corporation, say for 38 years, as I did at Newsday, and say for those 38 years, contributed to a 401k. And at the end of those 38 years, they are hugely owed. It is their money. For them to say, forget about the 401k. I'm going to go and take out a loan. No, this country belongs to African Americans. They built it. They worked 250 years for nothing. Yes, there should be self-determination, which is to say we have to decide. But it is. I mean, I think that Barack Obama teaches a very important lesson, is that the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, the Voting Act, had everything to do with this. And Barack Obama, who really is an ambassador to African Americans, strictly speaking, in the sense that his roots as an African American, not here, is trying to teach us a lesson, that we have every right to be president, senator, and we have to step forward and take that and not turn tails and abandon what you're fully invested in, which you've paid for more than any other group in this country, save the indigenous people whose land it is.
Right, but I'm going to continue. I think that takes a class character, though. You know what I'm saying? I think that what you're talking about, that's more, if we factor in class, I don't think poor and working class black people have anything vested in this country. You know, because we're still treated as crap. You know what I'm saying? I think like middle class black people, we don't necessarily experience white supremacy in the same level a poor or a working class black person does, but I think, you know.
So what I would say a couple of things. One is, you can have laws on the books. The question is accountability for enforcement of those laws to create opportunity. Okay. So I think what you're getting at is, at what point do people stand up and say, this is what the law says, so how does it work for us as a community? How does it work for us as a race? How does it work for us as a population? Now, I would add that also means you're fighting within the structure that exists, which is to say, we helped do this. This is ours to be had. If you say this is a land of equal opportunity, and you say this is the land of freedom, and that we're all created equal, then where does that equality come in? Mm-hmm. So I think you're right. There were many people who paid the price to be where we are now. That doesn't mean you abandon that. That means you take that and you say, that's the argument for why we deserve what everyone deserves, if we say we're truly living up to the ideals of this country. But I think maybe one of the piece that I'm hearing you say is, there's a piece on socioeconomics that always comes up, right? I mean, there's this question of race versus socioeconomics. Mm-hmm. Regardless of your socioeconomics, you still walk in the body that you walk in, with the skin color that you are, with the background that you have. And if I walk down the street, you can't tell that I grew up in the projects, or maybe you assume I did, right? I'm treated on that basis regardless of the package that I walk into. If my hair is in a ponytail and I don't have the suit on, is someone gonna assume that I know English or not? If I walk in like today and present myself the way I am, people may only assume, maybe they assume I'm a middle-class individual, but maybe they don't. And that has everything to do with my appearance, my race, my color, and how other people perceive that. So there's two different arguments there. You can't tell someone's socioeconomic status by staring at them. You can definitely tell someone's race. And so I think the treatment can be really clear based on skin color and race.
But I think the self-determination is to stand up and demand what you're entitled to. I think all too often we want to turn and run, or to wait for to care what someone else thinks. And a practical way it's done is that everybody should, in other words, you should speak openly on race and other matters, with your friends. You should organize openly, continuously on the job. For instance, take Ferguson. Ferguson is 66-point-something% African American, and yet that police force, 53 people on the police force, 50 of them are white. 4 of the 5 city councilmen are white. The mayor is white. When they have a vote, 66%, they can go and vote them out. That's what standing up and demanding your entitlement is about. And on that police force, for instance, okay, 3 African Americans out of 53. When Michael Brown was shot, the reason why they didn't give up Darren, whatever his name, Nelson, Darren Nelson, the reason why they didn't give his name up is because they say they were all on that trigger. For 6 days, they wouldn't give up his name because they said, we don't want to single him out because we were all on that trigger. We all killed him. This is a police force. We stand together. Now, my question is, what about those 3 African Americans who are on that police force? If I was on that police force, his name would have been out right then. Okay, and I did it at Newsday. I think you have to go in and you have to organize and not run away and shirk and talk about wait until they change their mind. It's just like Obama standing in line for McCain. He said, you got to be, or Hillary, you got to, or John Edwards, you got to be kidding. And that's what we have to understand. Come on, these people are, they have a system behind them. I'm talking about these individual people, but there's nothing, they're out of gas. There's nothing there. It is a paper tiger. There's 7 people. Look at the 7 people who ran against Obama for re-election. Look at them. Look at them. There's nothing there. And for us, African Americans who did not support Obama the first time around, half of the Black Caucus didn't support him. Governor Patterson didn't support him. Rangel didn't support him. Why didn't they support him? Well, because that's the question. What I say is that not because he's black, but because he was the better of those 2. And you have to stand up and demand. That's what self-determination is. Self-determination is standing up and demanding your rights. And by the way, on Ferguson, it is not getting on your knees, raising your hand, talking about I'm unarmed. Look, all you're doing is being kind to a sadist. These cops are sadists. They love that. You come to them on your knees, your hand up, they'll shoot you again. But there's a way that they won't shoot you again. The Black Liberation Army talked about it. The Black Panthers talked about it. The Nation of Islam talked about it. Malcolm X talked about it. And there's an art form. Ho Chi Minh talked about it. Mao talked about it. Mugabe talked about it. Mandela talked about it. All the answers are there.
Okay. Let's give a round of applause. Great answers. Great conversation.